So everybody, I sent a wonderful video conversation between my friend Rabbi Sharon and Brian Stevenson, which happened on Yom Kippur, to all of y'all. And it was so much in keeping with Sharon's unconventional, brilliant leadership that rather than preach a Yom Kippur sermon, she says, rather than preach a sermon where I was quoting Brian Stevenson all the time, I decided to talk with Brian Stevenson. So that's what happened. And it's so interesting that it's so packed with information that this PowerPoint presentation doesn't do it. A lot of honor. It's quite abbreviated, but it's power packed, and it so amazingly fits in. And I'm so glad that some of you had time to watch it, and some of you sent me some notes about it. So I've got a deck. A file on a slide on eCard. Just a second. Okay, let's. One other thing. So y'all, I am watching and using Richard Rohr's book, The Wisdom Pattern. I'm way behind in terms of making presentations, but this is about integrating what's happening in the here and now. So I'm not worried about Richard Rohr. We'll cover his book before we end, just before Advent. So now let's go to the first slide. Wesley, please. I wanted to put this slide on again because October 12 and October 19, we are one of 25 houses of worship throughout the country where we will gather by Zoom, and a lot of us will be in person. Hey, Barbara, I'm glad you said that. Yeah, this is not like any other Yom Kippur service. Anyway, the Morning into Unity. We have purple fabric that will cover the front of the church. We'll be wearing purple masks. Purple is a symbolic color of mourning. And we'll be sending you a few videos that I made today. One of the things that Sharon did on Wednesday for the national website. But you can go to the national website, and they may be already up, called Morning into Unity, to find out what that's all about. But we're very, very honored to have been chosen to be the Atlanta House of Worship. And we'll talk at the end of this PowerPoint slide presentation about the sadness that Brian Stevenson has about how hard it is to be a Black man in the United States. So I just wanted to tell you that we're going to have a place to carry our sadness and mourning after events like last night's debate, after more than 200,000 people dying in America, after more than 1 million people dying throughout the world. We need to grieve. So next slide. For people who are new to us tonight, this will be really, really quick, but we're dealing with the wisdom pattern, which is Richard Rohr's latest book, in which he says that all of life really has the story of order, disorder, and reorder. That is the story of the cross and resurrection. It's very important for me to always put in the resurrection along with the cross. And that modern civilization led to a lot of disappointment because its faith was in nationalism, scientism, fundamentalism, and that it got replaced by postmodernism, which has been signaled by chaos and no faith in any patterns of nihilism. And what he's opting for is a reality that's faced with contradictions, and that the cross is a visual metaphor for the paradoxical nature of all things, and that things do go into disorder and then go into a new order. And we're definitely going to be talking about that from a rabbinic perspective tonight. Next slide. I'm going to look at the chat box. Thanks. Thank you all for feedback. Okay, now we go to the next slide. I think Wesley may be having trouble with the slides.
Yeah, they're freezing up on me.
You okay, Wesley?
Can you hear me?
I can hear you, Wesley.
Okay. It's
faintly.
PowerPoint is freezing up on me for some reason.
I'm sorry?
The PowerPoint is freezing up on me for some reason.
So sorry. Well, let me fill the time. I don't want to. So a little forecast. Yes, the divine dance is very, 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 very good. Thanks, Kim Sidnor. So the last slide from last week was this slide. Teshuva is maybe the most used word during the high holy days of Judaism, the 10 days from Rosh Hashanah to Yom Kippur. And it is the Hebrew word for metanoia, or repentance or conversion. They are absolutely the same concept in Christianity with metanoia, or having a change of mind or a new mind, and teshuva, which means to turn around. And we had a lot of focus on teshuva and Rosh Hashanah, but it has continued throughout Yom Kippur, which was Sunday night and Monday. Just wanted to remind you all that we are tracking with the similar theology. Although John Cobb this past Sunday chastened me to say, don't kind of iron out all the differences. There are differences. There is the word other is important. And I didn't want to get into a fight with him, but it's very different to recognize difference of our otherness and otherizing people as a way of putting them down. Next slide. So here's Sharon, my dear friend. And she has the hippest Jewish community, I think, in the world. Thanks for the shout out to Diane Butler-Vass on Ilya's thing. So it is a hip place. And when they introduced their staff on the website, she is the founding and leading rabbi of the faith community, but she's called a spiritual badass, which of course she really, really is. And she is saying in the High Holy Days intro on their website that the High Holy Days for Jews really is a story about a world is dying and a new world is being born. Aha, sounds like Richard Rohr, sounds like Christianity, sounds like Jesus. And then her, pardon me, her whole Rosh Hashanah sermon was about grief, which ties into our mourning project. She says, you cannot have a civilization unless you grieve. She says, our ancestors grieved, they told the truth about the past, and they built a new future, a counter testimony to the world that was, and this is our blueprint. In other words, that's our wisdom pattern, she's saying from a Jewish perspective. An ancient wisdom born of suffering, and at the same time has a way forward through painful and uncertain times. So here's a woman who is really cool and with it, saying that we have to grieve in order to be sane and in order to have a civilization, and we can be people of hope because the suffering is the path through to a new story, a new world. Now, let me go ahead, and I'm having so much fun tying all these wise sages together. Charles Eisenstein is saying that the old world of separateness is dying. Now, let me just put an asterisk there to talk about the dying gasps of an old world of separateness that we saw in the debates last night. And Eisenstein is saying that world is dying and a new world is coming into being, which is the same as an ancient world, a world of interbeing where we are all enfolded with one another. She does sound like a Jewish Nadia Bolz-Weber, Bob. And this is a story that has got us, and it's giving us hope, and it's the only way forward. So just one more word about Sharon. You all could spend hours and hours and hours Googling her and watching her on YouTube. She's just an amazing friend, an amazing rabbi. And she's considered one of the top 10 rabbis in America. She is seen as reanimating religious life in America, developing a spiritual roadmap for soulful, multi-faith justice work in Los Angeles and around the country. Brian Stevenson brought her to the lynching memorial to pray and to help dedicate that place with the Jewish voice, hoping I got to see her and hug her neck there at the dedication. She founded IKAR, started in 2004, and has become a model for Jewish social revitalization in the US and beyond. I cannot recommend her enough as a great theologian, graduate of Columbia University, and lives in Los Angeles with her husband and 3 children. Next slide. Then we have her in dialogue with our friend Brian Stevenson, who founded the Equal Justice Initiative, and Desmond Tutu has called Brian America's Nelson Mandela. He founded EJI and it's been primarily an organization for the practice of law and the defense of people from the death penalty. And you all have read Just Mercy, which is bestseller, and now is a movie. Wonderful human being. And he has led Montgomery to have these 2 highly acclaimed cultural sites opened in 2018, the Legacy Museum, which is the lynching museum. The Civil Rights Museum and the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, the Lynching Museum. And these new national landmark institutions are destination places for people on pilgrimage. And Sharon mentions that in her video conversation with him. He's a graduate of Harvard Law and the Harvard School of Government. And I think he's a walking saint. Next slide. Now, I'm putting up the feelings wheel, and I got a new slide of this, which is much clearer. And what I'll do is I'll send it to you all. But at the end of this presentation, Brian goes to the feeling wheel. He did maybe not know anything about the feeling wheel, but he talks about how tired he is as a Black person in America. And in the fuchsia section of the feeling wheel, you can see the word tired there. And it goes to the core feeling of sadness. According to the visions model, which we're using at St. Luke's right now, there are 6 core feelings: mad, sad, scared, and peaceful, powerful, and joyful. And we can find out exactly which of the core feelings, which ones of them, because we usually are feeling more than one feeling at a time, by starting out. For instance, you can go to the orange out to the circumference and see embarrassed, and trace that back to the core feeling of scared. Now, the reason I bring all this up is because in order for us to go on this journey of leaving beside, or what Sharon calls later, shedding a story that doesn't work for us anymore so that we can make room for a new story. It's going to be important for us to pay attention to our feelings. And, next slide, understand that feelings are messengers. So when we are sad, for instance, you see it in the far left, the stimulus has been a real or anticipated loss. And the message is, I'm experiencing or anticipating bereavement, and what I need is comfort, space, and support to grieve and let go. Now that is the essence of this Mourning into Unity project, that a country which is on the verge of violence and explosiveness, seriously, which we saw telegraphed last night in that debate, it needs to have an understanding that our feelings have messages, and also they are messengers about what we need. So for a world or a nation or any system that has experienced a lot of loss, there's a need for sadness. And that's why Sharon Brous, Rabbi Sharon Brous, preached about sadness and grieving her entire Rosh Hashanah sermon. Now, I hope that you'll take a look at this slide, and you can think about any feelings. And again, we oftentimes have multiple feelings at the same time. And ask the question, what is that particular feeling communicating to me? It is an angel. Angel means messenger. It is bringing a message to us. Okay, so we'll go on and we can come back to that if you want to. Now, Sharon Brous, Rabbi Brous, starts out in her conversation with Brian Stevenson, talking about how she was glad that they videoed it as close to Yom Kippur as possible and not way out ahead. I've been practicing that for a long time in terms of my forums. I get forums kind of together at the last minute so that we can talk about what's going on. But she says that because we need to have a real reckoning in this very heavy moment with both the death of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg and the fact that no charges have been brought against the Louisville police who killed Breonna Taylor about her. One of them has gotten charged with a reckless endangerment of the apartment next to Breonna, but not anything about Breonna. That Sharon Brous is saying this is a time for a real look at our national narrative, which we're going to get into tonight. Next slide. So Brian responds to that simply by saying that this long-standing problem that has hovered over the nation since the very beginning, which results in frustration and anger, is like a polluted sky, that we're not free of this pollution. We're burdened by a history of racial inequality and racial injustice, and we breathe that air, and it doesn't create healthy spaces for everyone. There are many of us who are so privileged that we don't have to think about this. But he is representing tonight the voice of those who cannot escape it. And he and Sharon, Rabbi Brous, talk about ending that silence. Next slide. Now, one of the stories that he insists on our really coming to terms with is that our modern police system has some threads that go back to police being those who rounded up fugitives and were supported by the Fugitive Slave Act. And that throughout our struggles for freedom, frequently police officers, not all police officers by any means, but some police officers have been there to be the symbols of beating and battering those people who were fighting for civil rights. And that our incarceration system with mass incarceration has our modern police there to enforce that. Now, interestingly enough, John Cobb surprised me, the guy who's in our forum this past Sunday, saying we really do need to rethink policing from the community or the ecological system perspective. Back to Brian Stevenson, he ends this particular part of the dialogue by saying it is frustrating, talking about Breonna Taylor's Louisville, when the justice system doesn't respond like it should, as in the case of Breonna Taylor, it leads to a breaking point. And that's what so many people in our country are saying that we are close to, is a breaking point. Now, Martha Eskew was asking, I think, the deep question about what was last night about. I really do think that one of the things that we have to consider is that last night was a symptom of the breaking point that many feel America faces right now. Next slide. So Sharon Brous goes back and asks, what would it mean to shed a narrative and to even birth a narrative that we could all be on the same side of? She says, that's the foundational issue of narrative. That's what we're studying, my friends, this fall. Story, 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 the power of story. Charles Eisenstein says, it's our stories that create our policies, and we create the stories. So, Rabbi Brous is talking about the power of a shared narrative, what it means to build a nation on a narrative that is not an honest narrative. Isabel Wilkerson in Caste gives a really great metaphor, and Rabbi Brous echoes that metaphor of a house that's built on instability. What would it mean to shed a narrative that is not a good underpinning for an entire country and give birth to a new one? So she poses that to Brian Stevenson and then tells the Sodom and Gomorrah story the way it actually is in the Bible. Now, I want to pause here about theologians and churchy people misleading us in reading the Bible correctly. Most people think that Sodom and Gomorrah has to do with homosexuality. That's where we got the word sodomite, and to sodomize someone, on and on and on. That is a misreading of the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. The true story of Sodom and Gomorrah was about a city, Sodom, that closed its borders to outsiders and punished those people who tried to help. As Rabbi Brous tells the theology of it, it was a scarcity mentality. It had terrible crimes of cheating the poor and attacking those who exercised compassion. It was an immoral legal system that was set up in Sodom based on a scarcity ethic to prop up all the cruelties. It was the ethics of Sodom. And the rabbis told the story because Sodom could be burned, which is represented in this icon. But the ethics of Sodom could rear its ugly head wherever it could. You can have anywhere you want a system whereby strangers are kept away, or people who are considered inferior. And it is a crime to express any compassion to those folks. And the rabbis who created the Hebrew Bible needed this Sodom and Gomorrah story to counter such a cruel system that can crop up anywhere. And Patty Williams says it sounds really familiar right now. So, now, Rabbi Brous went to some lengths to tell the real story of Sodom, or as she pronounces in Hebrew, Sodom, to pose to Brian Stevenson the power of a story that can create immorality, harshness, violence, injustice, and oppression, even to the people who counter it. It's all, again, about story. What about shedding that narrative? So she poses it to him. Next slide. Now, the way she puts it is winning or losing, one or the other, the narrative war. And she poses to him. And this is from him. She would have been quoting from him in her sermon. What happens when the South loses the war itself, but wins the narrative war, which you will see in a few minutes. Brian argues that the South lost the war, but won the narrative war in the lost cause myth. And still, Rabbi Brous saying, what's the danger of the pervasiveness of that narrative? And is there a way for America to extract itself from that narrative so that we can be and do something that is very new and different? Now, what's coming to my mind, I have to be candid, is this business of that violent group of men that last night the president said, stand back, but stand by. And underneath that is a whole lot of supremacy and violence. And it is resonant with this lost cause notion. Next slide. So now we have Brian Stevenson responding. And this is a slide of a very moving piece of public public sculpture on the beautiful rolling grounds of the Lynching Museum in Montgomery. And that is up there on the hill, and we'll have another picture of it in the next slide. In any case, Brian Stevenson, he's the BS and Sharon is the SB in here. He says, people of faith, she's asking, how can you change the narrative? How can you shed an old, violent, oppressive narrative? Pardon me. And have a new one. Oh, Martha Eskew saying the lost cause is well done with the Sakurama. Anyway, Brian Stevenson says, people of faith have been informed and told what can happen when a false narrative inhabits a society. It can corrupt a just society. God told us what would happen when society intolerates injustice through the prophets, Jeremiah, Amos, Isaiah. They were the ones who were saying, look, thus says the Lord, it's not what you're saying religion is. I mean, Isaiah 58 is the piece that we read on Ash Wednesday, and it happens to be the piece that's read on Yom Kippur, which is, this is not the fast that I require. I don't care about putting ashes on your head. What I care about is how you treat poor people, how you treat people who are outcasts. So the role of the prophets, and he quotes, what does the law require? 3 things: to do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with God. That orientation, he says, sits on us. We have a special obligation to respond to the narratives of our oppression with the narrative of justice, mercy, and humility. Next slide. So I know this is a lot of verbiage, but I just didn't want to leave it out. Now, the reason I have this image here is because of a Christian theology that has Jesus saves as the overriding banner, and underneath it is the perpetuation of a caste system, i.e. Isabel Wilkerson, of racial superiority and inferiority. And so he says, Brian, that the narrative of racial hierarchy got set up. We slaughtered native populations, established a country based on equality while telling a story of racial hierarchy that justified enslavement. He speaks so compassionately toward the enslavers. The slavers didn't want to think of themselves as immoral, so they invented the story that enslaved persons were less equal, less human, not as human as white people. And the real evil was this narrative of the ideology of white supremacy that infested everything. Racial hierarchy survived enslavement. It even survived abolition, because he said the abolitionists ended slavery, but they didn't end the story of inequality underneath the practice of slavery. So we didn't end the story underneath slavery. And that's the true evil. The true evil of slavery doesn't end in 1865. It evolves because the narrative of racial difference and hierarchy was the true evil, and it persisted. Slavery loses the Civil War, but not the narrative war. The North wins the Civil War, but the South wins the narrative war. Slavery laws end, but the argument against racial superiority doesn't win. The 13th Amendment passage, which talks about ending involuntary servitude and forced slavery, but doesn't talk about, the 13th Amendment doesn't put an end to the story about racial hierarchy and white supremacy, so we don't effectively end slavery. The narrative struggle doesn't win. The 14th Amendment, giving Black people equal protection, and the 15th Amendment, giving the right to vote, both of those amendments passed, but were not enforced for over a century, and lynching persisted. Next slide. So here is this memorial to lynching with the names of all the people we know who have, Martha's saying, what's the family? Yep, I know him. Jesus all the time. Jesus, yeah, all the time. And so we've had a narrative failure in our country because the period of lynching tells us everything about a narrative failure. The strength it took in the 50s and the 60s to push against that and to protest even when beaten. And the laws of 1964, the Civil Rights Act, and 1965, the Voting Rights Act, are passed, but the narrative persisted. And the narrative of racial difference persists with us today. Now, the reason I'm going to such lengths, and I'm feeling the sadness myself, I just want to be in touch with my feelings. And if those of you who are feeling sad or whatever right now, I'm wanting to have an evening here where we can do that and get to Brian Stevenson's, the slide where Brian Stevenson talks about his exhaustion. Next slide. So I think this is it. So the question that she continues to pose, is it possible to evolve a new American narrative? So back to Brian Stevenson's words. He says, it hurts my heart for me to tell Black students graduating with professional degrees. He's not singling them out. He's saying to anybody, and he's also giving an example of telling people who are having professional degrees that they're not going to miss out on the fact that they still have to navigate a narrative that results in the presumption of dangerousness and guilt. Now, let me just pause right there. When Dylan Roof killed all those people in Charleston at Wednesday night Bible study, I went to Wednesday night Bible study all my life. And here's this white kid who goes in and has Bible study with these beloved people, African Americans, who are gathered for Wednesday night Bible study. And then he has his Bible out in his backpack. And then he pulls out the gun and kills 9 of them and refers to white supremacy, has a Confederate flag. I went to school on what is the Confederate consciousness. And the things that Brian is saying right here, the presumption of dangerousness and guilt are part and parcel of the Confederate conspiracy, and it's all about the cross. Jesus saves. So when you constantly have to navigate these presumptions, he says, you get tired. And he tells a couple of stories on the video about being pulled over, gun put to his head. Here's this brilliant walking saint in America who's having to endure this. And so many of us are just tired. It's exhausting to live in a space where the burden is always on you to calm down this young white officer who has a gun pulled. It's dangerous and it's lethal. I have had, he said, Adelaide says he was constantly confused as the client, not the attorney. He said, I have had to mask my own humiliation in order to try to get justice for my clients. The only way we can change these narratives is to understand who we are as people of faith about justice and compassion. So Sharon, Rabbi Brous says, is it possible to evolve a new American narrative where we could all find ourselves on the same side of history? So I think that's the last slide, right, Wesley? Yeah. So let's bring everybody back together. Yeah. And let me just kind of reiterate why it was important for me to go here tonight. And it is because I think we really do need to pay attention to where we are in America right now. I did not expect for us to refer to last night's debates tonight, but there were some competing narratives going on there. I think that I'm so glad the Holy Spirit has arranged for us to have this mourning time on October 13 and October 19, and calling the entire nation. The political system is not calling us to mourn. We are calling one another to have a time of mourning, mourning and grieving. And we're doing it through houses of worship. There have been studies that where cultures are close to explosion or implosion, through divisiveness and polarization and violence, to the degree you can get everyone across the aisle to come together to grieve, that you can inch your culture to healing and not to violent explosion. Now, when I set up this study of Richard Rohr's book 4 weeks ago, I never intended for us to be at this point. tonight. But here we have had this kind of building drumbeat of violent divisiveness. And we, people of religion and compassion and love, have a responsibility to interrupt it through the grieving process and to interrupt it through a new narrative, to shed a narrative that says that there is hierarchical worth in humanity. It's all coming together in an amazing way in my mind. I want to preach it, I want to teach it, and I want us in our faith community to embody it. So that I'm just amazed that that is how that conversation between Sharon Brous and Brian Stevenson went. And that the bookend big days of the High Holy Days, Rosh Hashanah and then Yom Kippur, had Sharon Brous talking about sadness and grieving as a way of moving into the new year and shedding an old narrative in the light of a narrative we can all get behind. Judith Smith, who knows something about grieving, just said, mourning is the pathway to repentance. So we have the space to accept a new narrative without being held back by guilt. Exactly. And the whole notion of centering prayer, I'm almost finished with my 4 or 5 little videos about centering prayer. The whole point of centering prayer is to go down through all your feelings down to the still, sweet point of mercy where you can let go of everything that's keeping you from being an oasis of mercy in other people's lives. For you to experience the oasis of mercy and compassion in your life so that you can be an instrument of that in others. So what I want to do is spend 10 minutes in our group tonight, and then come back and have 10 minutes. Well, it'll be about 7 minutes to report out to one another. Well, let's do 7 and 7, okay? Let's not take a full 10. So here's the question. What do you need to express on the feeling level tonight? Or what do you need to express on this business of shedding an old narrative and having a new narrative? And where are you in your letting go of an old false narrative? Learn something new, read something new, have a conversation with somebody, and then so that you can move to the new one. Oh, 2 more things. I'm sorry. When we have Lent with Ebenezer Baptist Church and we read Cast together, we are going to have an opportunity for people from a predominantly Black church and predominantly white church to come together in proximity to talk on the feeling level and also to talk about this narrative. So I'm seeing us getting ready for that as a system. I just think the Holy Spirit is leading us along the path of grace, and I feel the energy. So let's spend 7 minutes in breakout times and answer anything you want to of the things that I brought up. Okay, and we'll see you back here in 7 minutes.